turn this on. Testing, testing, see.
This hearing for the Subcommittee on Africa will come to order. I note that a quorum is not present, but I'm sure it will be soon. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on U.S. policy in the Sahel region. This afternoon, we're here to discuss the fragile state of the Sahel and the short and long-term options for peace and stability in the region. Without objection, all members have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and other materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I'd like to thank our witnesses for coming today to speak with us about the U.S. policy in the Sahel region. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. I've been concerned about the Sahel region for some time, mostly because of the ongoing and increasing violence and what I previously thought was an expanding U.S. military presence in the region. What I am most concerned about was making sure that we were balancing diplomacy and development with the U.S. defense engagement. Over the past decade, many countries in the Sahel region have experienced unanticipated political transitions caused by local dissatisfaction with political elites and worsening governing conditions. AQIM and Boko Haram have since capitalized on the region's political instability and reportedly merged with locally based and rural extremist groups in Mali and Burkina Faso. The expanding network of transnational terror groups has led to a proliferation of violent incidents between 2016 and 2018. Within the region, Mali and Burkina Faso appear to be the epicenters of conflict. After a military coup in 2012 and a popular uprising in 2014, both countries are grappling with Islamic insurgencies that threaten state and regional security. Some may think the Sahel may not have direct implications for U.S. national security because most of the armed groups in the region often target locally or regionally. I also want to acknowledge the 4 brave soldiers who were ambushed and killed in an advise and assist mission in Tongo Tongo in western Niger on October 4th, 2017. Violent extremism in the region is escalating at a disturbing rate, but the majority of the actors do not seem to be ideologically motivated, and we would certainly like to hear your opinions about that. They seem to be drawn in because of governance challenges, including political exclusion or abuse by state actors, widespread poverty, marginalization along ethnic or regional lines, and tensions between farmer and herder communities over land or water. I raise this because we know that defense and security assistance cannot address the issues emerging out of the Sahel. We have to focus on the root causes, and we know that development is one of the areas that need to be addressed. But with that said, the increased attacks are real. So several weeks back, I led a CODEL focused on U.S. military engagement across Africa, and we traveled to parts of the Sahel to gain a better understanding of our military assistance in the region. I spoke with many heads of state, foreign ministers, our own ambassadors, and military personnel, and security was never far from their minds. U.S. personnel and locally employed staff in the region are operating under very difficult circumstances, but I was always impressed by their hard work and their dedication for their jobs. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses about the safety and security of U.S. government personnel in the region. And members of the CODEL also heard that there are, in some countries, numerous positions that are unfilled within the embassies, and so leaving them short-staffed and them feeling like they really weren't able to address the conditions that they confronted, the reasons why they were there, and would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. So I believe in order to combat the spread of terrorism in the region, the international community should support the efforts of the G5 Sahel Force, which consists of troops from Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger by helping to train soldiers and assisting in funding operations so that the troops are coming from those countries as opposed to outside. I also believe that the long-term solution is to develop the infrastructure, including access to water, telecommunication, energy, and roads. This will help socioeconomic development and reveal tangible results of a healthier, more educated, food-secure, and safer society. Members of Congress on both sides want to see extreme violence in the Sahel decrease, and we're here to listen and to see how you might provide us insights and recommendations as to how we move forward. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to thank you, Chairwoman Bass, for convening this extremely important hearing this afternoon. We as a subcommittee last focused on the Sahel, As a region in the May of 2013, though we have addressed fragility in specific states and discrete issues such as food insecurity in the region. Many of the same threats we dealt with at that time, such as Islamic insurgencies, have grown even greater, so today's hearing is especially timely. Our policy interests in the Sahel encompass counterterrorism concerns, as well as humanitarian ones, and it's impossible to address one without addressing the other. Without security, you will see a continuing large amounts of human suffering, and without addressing security, we've got to be sure that it's secure and the humanitarian work can be done. The reasons for instability in the region are multiple, from failures of governance to Islamic radicalization, from environmental degradation to ethnic conflict. Nor can we minimize the consequences of our disastrous intervention in Libya in 2011, which, among other things, led to the influx of arms into the region from the arsenal of former Libyan strongman Colonel Gaddafi, following his overthrow and the chaos that ensued. There's a very comprehensive report, Madam Chair, from the Conflict Armament Research Group entitled Investigating Cross-Border Weapons Transfers in the Sahel from November 2016. I would ask if it could be made a part of the record. I appreciate that. This report details how, quote, the demise of the Gaddafi regime in the mid-2011, following the emergence of armed opposition and a NATO-led multinational intervention, released large parts of the national stockpile from government control. The report goes on to state how the proliferation of weapons from Gaddafi-era stockpiles fueled the 2012 Tuareg and Islamic insurgencies in Mali and has allowed armed actors operating throughout the Sahel region, including in Chad and Niger, and possibly in the Central African Republic and Cote d'Ivoire, to acquire weapons, including small arms and man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, close quote. The report also notes how large numbers of Tuareg fighters who have been recruited into Gaddafi's Islamic Legion, the Maghawir Brigade, and other parts of the Libyan army left for Mali and Niger in 2011. And that is just the portion of the report dealing with the Sahel. A tremendous amount of arms also found their way into Syria and into the hands of ISIS fighters who carved out their Channel House caliphate around Raqqa. The collapse of Libya into civil war also fractured its oil-based economy, which in turn led to a drying up of economic opportunity for young men from the nations and women of the Sahel. Thus, we think we need to confront the fact that while many of the problems in the region are endemic, our policy failures and misbegotten adventurism in 2011 helped fuel the crisis, which we must address today. A regional multidisciplinary approach to this crisis is necessary. Of course, there is a military aspect to our engagement in the region. The deaths, as you pointed out, Madam Chair, of the 4 Americans soldiers in 2017 near the village of Tonga Tonga at the hands of a group which has declared an affiliation with the Islamic State and the Islamic State of Greater Sahara underscores the sacrifices that are being made to counter terrorism. I understand that efforts were made to get Defense Department participation in today's hearing, but they asserted jurisdictional issues, and that prevented it. Thus, I look forward to the State Department briefing us on our counterterrorism efforts, in addition to overall efforts of bringing stability to the region. So I do look forward to their expert witness, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I'd now like to introduce our witnesses. Whitney Baird assumed duties as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for West Africa and Security Affairs in September of 2018. Previously, she served as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Europe and European Union and Regional Affairs in the European Bureau. She was Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in London from 2014 to 2017. In addition to a number of positions in D.C., she has also served overseas in Spain, Senegal, Togo, Canada, and Cameroon. Our second witness, Cheryl Anderson, is the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Africa, where she has been responsible for West Africa and development planning. Before that, she served as Acting Assistant Administrator for Africa. Ms. Anderson joined USAID as a Foreign Service Officer in 1988 and has extensive field experience. She served as the USAID Mission Director for South and Southern Africa, Ghana, and East Africa, and as Deputy Mission Director for East Africa. Before that, her overseas assignments included Sudan, Eastern and Southern Africa Regional, Uganda, and the DRC. She began her career as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana. We thank you both for your service. We have several members of Congress that were also Peace Corps members. Ms. Barrett. You mentioned that we do have your full testimony, and so we would like for you to speak for 5 minutes, and I believe you can see that. When the light turns yellow, you have a minute. When it turns red, time's up. Thank you.
Perfect. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee. It is a pleasure to be here today to discuss the complex challenges in the Sahel and our approach to them. First, I want to thank you for the interest and support we receive from Congress and from this subcommittee. Your willingness to visit the region and engage directly with the men and women at our embassies across Africa is greatly appreciated. The rapidly spreading instability in the Sahel threatens U.S. national security and undermines our diplomatic goals. It enables the spread of terrorism, stifles economic growth, and thwarts democratic institutions. We are focused on 3 lines of effort: greater coordination with international and regional partners, bolstering state legitimacy in the region, and implementing the Algiers Accord in Mali. Despite our efforts, the situation in the Sahel continues to deteriorate. In Mali, signatories of the Algiers Peace Accord underperform on efforts to implement it. Terrorist groups exploit intercommunal tensions to further undercut tenuous government presence. And yet the government has largely failed to take the steps needed to reestablish state legitimacy and address insecurity. We engage at every level with the Malian government, with its neighbors and international partners to encourage progress and to hold bad actors accountable. Burkina Faso faces its own terrorist threat, compounded by cross-border incursions from neighboring violent extremists, but its ability to respond is limited. We employ diplomatic, defense, and development initiatives to help respond to the crisis and prevent violence and insecurity from spreading further. On the other hand, Niger has managed to prevent extensive terrorist incursions, in spite of instability on 4 borders. Niger is a good partner in a bad neighborhood. However, the security response we think is unsustainable. Niger is spending close to 25% of its budget on security, and that really precludes its investing in its people's needs. We focus on coordinating with partners and shoring up state legitimacy. We are also aware of the possibility that instability could take root in the coastal states, directly threatening the heart of U.S. economic interests in the region. We are exploring ways to help these countries develop accountable, stable security institutions and promote human rights and good governance. We approach this litany of challenges through a comprehensive and balanced approach. Security-focused solutions are necessary but not sufficient in and of themselves. Development tools help government provide vital services to their citizens and improve economic opportunities for populations. Diplomatic engagement encourages good governance, improves coordination with our partners and other donors, and advances cornerstone objectives, such as implementing the Algiers Accord. Our embassies maintain robust dialogue with civil society organizations that play a crucial role in stabilizing the region and holding governments accountable. Our African partners also play a vital role, and the Sahelian countries have exercised greater leadership in addressing their fragility and security challenges. For example, as you had mentioned, the G5 Sahel takes a holistic approach to security, and the coastal states have launched the Accra Initiative to improve security coordination and information sharing in their military and security services. We also appreciate the increased role played by ECOWAS in coordinating the broader region's response to the crisis. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Wonderful, Ms. Anderson.
Good afternoon, Chair Bass, Ranking Member Smith. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Sahel and the rising violence we're seeing there. The dynamics underpinning violence in the Sahel are caused by a mix of persistent instability, poverty, deteriorating environmental conditions, governance challenges, and lack of economic opportunity, all fertile ground for extremists determined to advance their ideology. USAID Administrator Mark Green has emphasized the urgency of addressing this violence. I appreciate the chance to share with you what we're doing to respond to the crisis, to help reduce the violence, and to support resilience and eventual self-reliance. As you've heard from Deputy Assistant Secretary Baird, the Sahel is a vast and complex region with rapidly spreading insecurity. We've seen an increase in violent extremist activity, intercommunal conflict, and violence related to criminal networks and other armed groups. Just last week, a deputy mayor who was also a member of parliament in Burkina Faso was assassinated. We were deeply saddened by this news. He was well known for his personal commitment to peace and good governance. The escalation in violence has increased humanitarian needs, particularly in the tri-border area of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. At the same time, the presence of armed groups along those border areas has limited our humanitarian access. Population displacements are on the rise, with more than 270,000 refugees and more than 900,000 internally displaced people in those three countries. The situation is especially worrying in Burkina Faso. When I visited in March, we were alarmed that the number had just surpassed 100,000. That number now is close to 500,000. Despite the enormous security challenges, we're responding to these humanitarian needs. USAID has provided over $130 million in humanitarian assistance in the three countries during fiscal year 2019, which includes emergency food aid and health services. Such humanitarian assistance is central to USAID's mission. We will always stand with other countries when a humanitarian crisis strikes. But we also want to help our partner countries move towards the day when they no longer need our assistance. In the Sahel, USAID has developed a strategic vision and will work with our partners to address priority issues: countering violent extremism, building citizen responsive governance, and strengthening resilience. I'd like to give you a few examples. In countering violent extremism, USAID's Voices for Peace program features broadcast radio and video programming on themes of peace, tolerance, good governance, and human rights, all in local languages and locally produced in partnership with respected local leaders and institutions. Voices for Peace generates positive local narratives and constructive dialogues about extremism. One of the results has been an 18% jump in listeners who now feel confident that working in partnership with security forces can be an effective way to combat violent extremism. In the area of citizen responsive governance, with USAID's help, one example is that local governments are now better able to manage their natural resources and community conflicts. Last year, USAID activities strengthened the effectiveness of almost 900 water user associations in Burkina Faso and Niger. USAID also supported the development of conflict mediation, which has helped reduce tensions in the region. These kinds of activities are critical to building stable, free societies and decreasing the appeal of extremist ideologies. Finally, on resilience, in Burkina Faso and Niger, USAID's resilience program, known as RISE, helps individuals and communities to better manage crises, feed their families, and invest in their futures. Over the past 5 years, households in communities reached by RISE have diversified livelihoods and rely less on government assistance to cope with shocks. One measure of success is that participants in RISE agricultural activities have seen their incomes grow by an average of 45%. While the situation in the Sahel presents a complex set of challenges, one thing we're sure of is that the situation won't get better if the United States looks the other way. Left unaddressed, extremist violence in the region will likely spread elsewhere, affecting security and well-being of U.S. economic partners and allies. That's why our efforts are vital. USAID is expanding our presence in the region, and we thank you for your support in that effort. We endeavor to leverage all available resources with our interagency colleagues and other partners to ensure the most effective and sustainable solutions to the challenges in the region. Thank you for your time, your interest, and your leadership. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and answering your questions.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. We're now going to begin questions. I'll go for 5 minutes and then refer to my ranking member here. So I really wanted to get a sense from both of you about what more needs to be done. I mean, I don't doubt that you're doing everything you can, but from your perspective, what more needs to be done? And then I also would like to know how we engage other countries, especially France. What impressed me about Burkina Faso was the number of violent attacks have increased several thousand% since May. And it wasn't clear, you know, and I mentioned the fact that the embassy is understaffed. And so I wanted to know if you could comment to that. Does that look surprised, Ms. Anderson? No. Maybe I won't say, maybe let me rephrase that and say that there are numerous positions unfilled. That to me is understaffed, but said differently. Yeah, go right ahead.
Chairwoman Bass, thank you very much. I'll take these on in turn on what more needs to be done. So if we look at the situation across the region as a whole, I think each country, if we look at the G5 Sahel and take each country is a little bit of a different case. So I'll start with Mali and then maybe talk about Burkina, and we can go from there. With Mali, really, I think that there is the question of both political will and coordination. I think political will is an internal question for the Malian government in making continued progress in implementing the Algiers Accord. The Algiers Accord is the instrument that we have, blessed by the United Nations and undergirded by MINUSMA, to move forward, really, the political stalemate with the three signatory parties. And we think it's very important that the government continue to make progress in meeting the benchmarks. And we really do believe that renewed political stability in Mali is one of the things that will help reduce the level of violence elsewhere in the region. We have seen also an increase in intercommunal violence in the center of Mali, although what we have seen is that the government has taken some efforts to stem that, and it has had some positive effect. So with intervention by the government, it can take progress. What I will say in a greater sense is I think that we have many donors and many international partners with interest who are putting assistance of various kinds, whether it's security, development, humanitarian, as well as diplomatic efforts in the region. What I think we don't need is more. I think what we do need is better focus and better coordination and better organization. We are not the only ones who feel this way. It is clear in our interactions with the French, with the European Union, and others that others are feeling this as well, and we are seeing a convergence, and I am hoping that by doing that, that we will have a better coordinated effort to assist the Malian government. If the Malian government will show the political will to move forward, that we can look at what does a post-MINUSMA Mali look like, what fills that security space in an effective way.
Didn't the French just send in troops?
Sorry?
Didn't the French just send in troops?
The French have had troops there as part of Operation Barkhane.
Yeah, but I mean increased.
For, actually, they
in the last few weeks, I thought.
They have more, but they've shifted a good bit of their focus to Burkina Faso to really take on the the surge in jihadist violence in Burkina. At the risk of going over my time in Burkina, I think it is providing assistance and helping the Burkinabe organize their efforts to combat the attacks. I think, and would pass to my colleague, I think really in Burkina, part of what will have a long-lasting effect, positive effect, is sort of that grinding work at a community level to rebuild state presence and state services to the population. That's the kind of the work that USAID is doing on a community level, and I think that in Burkina, in the long run, is what will help them push back on the violence.
Go on.
Okay, on staffing, actually, I would like to talk about Niger just briefly, because again, I have noted that I think Niger has been an excellent partner for us. They've been quite serious in their work, both to combat the violence inside their borders, but also to do so in an effective and accountable way. The reality for us, again, what more can we do? We continue to partner with them. We continue to carry out our efforts in the broader region because they are beset on really every border. But again, it is through kind of the community development and humanitarian assistance that USAID and other donor partners that allow Niger to deliver the kind of services to their population that builds state legitimacy, and that's really important for long-term success. On staffing, it is absolutely true. If I had a magic wand, I would probably bump up staffing at all of these embassies. Their workload has increased greatly with, of course, the increase in violence. We are continually looking at ways to assist and backfill positions. These are austere operating environments, even in the best of times. We have people who unexpectedly have to leave because of medical emergencies and other issues. That's a fact of working in that part of Africa. What we do from Washington is try to look for additional TDY support and ways to ensure that we can lighten their load.
TDY? Is that what you said?
Sorry?
TDY?
TDY, sorry, temporary duty. Yeah. So try to send people out 6, 8 weeks, maybe 2 months, 6 months.
So it's not a question of your funding?
That wouldn't be a question that I could actually answer. I would probably defer that to our Undersecretary for Management.
Okay, Mr. Smith?
Madam Chair, thank you both for your great testimony and your leadership. Deeply appreciated. Just a few questions. One of them, with 2020 hindsight, can you tell us briefly what went wrong with Mali? Because that was, back in 2012, before the coup, touted as a democratic government model or an example. Secondly, if you could, religion and ethnicity are core concerns with respect to questions of identity among people in the Sahel, and are also factors that fuel conflict. And I know we always talk about other things too, but how would you rate the importance of those two issues, religion and ethnicity, and what can be done to mitigate that so there's greater understanding across those barriers between the two? If I could too, as well, on the issue of some diseases. We know Burkina Faso is among the 10 countries, according to USAID, with the highest malaria disease burden in the world. And I'm wondering, how is our funding being directed towards that in Burkina Faso? And what about the other Sahel countries? How bad off are they, given the unpredictability of their climate, which very often can lead to this? Mali, you've highlighted the Feed the Future program there, and of course food insecurity is big everywhere, but maybe you could spend a little time talking about what our efforts are. Is there a concern of an approaching drought that might need some, prior thinking, which I'm sure you're doing? Is the first 1,000 days being implemented in these countries to ensure that both mother and baby are as healthy as they can be during pregnancy and then up until usually the second birthday? Of course, after that's important too, but as we all know, that is critically important. Mali is the only country that's in PEPFAR, and I'm wondering if you could just speak to that briefly and whether or not other countries are perhaps in the queue to be put into the PEPFAR program, PEPFAR initiative. We did reauthorize it, as you know. Last year, I was the author of that bill. It was totally bipartisan, and it's authorized for 5 years. Of course, we always worry about the appropriation side of it, but if you could speak to, because I think PEPFAR is one of the greatest successes, just like the malaria initiative in saving lives and mitigating morbidity among so many. Protection of health and humanitarian workers. Our distinguished chairwoman and I, have been talking over and over with all the key players in DR Congo and the threats to the lives of health workers. We know that's always a problem. How big of a problem is it in the Sahel?
Start with that. Thank you very much. So that's quite a lineup of questions. I think I will try to take on a bit of the first two, and then I will pass it to my colleague, who has a great deal more information on the intervention in health and humanitarian assistance. With Mali, I think what went wrong, I think that what we saw was the result of many years of frustration, of lack of state presence. I think for us, the Department of State and our work with countries, that we think that it is absolutely crucial that the state is viewed in general as part of the solution, not part of the problem, and that there in fact is state presence delivering services to their population, that security services are deemed to be accountable and transparent and respecting of human rights. I think that in 2012 in Mali, you saw a breakdown in many of these and a lack of state presence in large parts of the country, and an expression of dissatisfaction on parts of the population, and absolutely as well the spillover effects of the events in Libya. Absolutely. We can go back and revisit that. I think we were much more focused at this point now on in
Again, past is prologue. The idea is, what we can learn from
Right.
all of this sometimes prevents the next crisis.
So I think that you touched on some of the issues: religion, ethnicity. I think intercommunal competition for resources in an area undergoing desertification, food insecurity, unequal distribution of resources, and again, lack of state presence. For us, in any of these countries, religion and ethnicity are important. These are all multi-ethnic and multi-religious communities, and again, the best antidote are transparent, accountable, and democratic institutions.
Thank you very much. You touched on a number of very important issues, and if I miss any, we'll be sure to get back to you with more details. Yes, this is a really high disease burden, so we are responding with our humanitarian assistance to health issues, but we can't forget the long-term commitment to building health systems in the Sahel. And that's an important part of building resilience and building institutions for eventual self-reliance in those countries. We've had a long-term commitment in health in Mali, as you know, but also in Burkina, we have a particular emphasis on malaria. That's the biggest killer of children under 5, is malaria now. And we're seeing some good advances, which I saw when I was on my trip. Also, we do have PEPFAR activities in Burkina Faso where we're working towards the 90-90-90 goals of PEPFAR. And it's part of a regional program that we have that's relatively small, because we're talking about relatively small populations. But there is a lot in common across a number of the West African countries on their efforts to get to epidemic control of HIV. So we're pretty proud of that small program, and we're seeing pretty good progress there despite all the challenges. On our food security work and addressing drought, that is always a central part of what we have been doing. We have especially important programs in Mali and Niger for Feed the Future, and we're constantly using whatever technology we can find to predict what's coming up but also our efforts are very strong on building resilience to whatever next shock is coming. We know that there are constant shocks from drought in the Sahel. I think I've covered most of those questions.
And first 1,000 days?
The first 1,000 days, that's also really important for us, including in the Sahel. I'd be happy to provide some more detail.
Thank you. I would appreciate that very much.
In
We would.
writing.
Let me just ask you if I could, and I thank the gentlelady from California for some additional time. So we can better understand and address the problems of the Sahel, can you give a little more specific, be a little more specific in addressing the grievances of the Tuareg and the Fulani? How is that being addressed to try to mitigate, again, their bouts of violence? On the issue of Russia and China, what's the footprint of China these days in the Sahel? We know what they've done in much of Africa and have a general sense of what they're doing there, but would love to see your current insights, particularly with the debt burden that they place on countries, and in many cases, the fleecing of their natural resources at bargain basement prices. So if you could speak to that as well.
Thank you. So, I mean, further on grievances of individual communities, I think, again, overall, I think that we do, so I would say we view with some concern that competition, I think our view is competition for resources has pushed a level of intercommunal violence that is creating a situation where it is easy to, and often there is a demonization of herder communities, certainly the Pul, the Fulani among them. I think from our perspective, there is no good to become from this. This is an area where there needs to be continued community building and intervention, both by civil society and state institutions, to ensure that communities are continually communicating on how they share resources, share space, and share economic opportunities. And I think only with those kinds of interventions and those kinds of conversations do you get to a long-term solution to those kinds of grievances. I think there is a reality that desertification, climate change is creating a situation, along with demographic pressure, that this competition for resources is not going to reduce, it's going to increase. So again, a state presence that is effective and community organization, civil society intervention in building that kind of dialogue is really the only way in the long run to get at those underlying grievances.
If I could, excuse me 1 second, but and the religious community, are they playing a vital role?
I think it's very important that the religious community, I think that one of the ways that jihadist extremists break down community structures is by breaking down that communication, that role that traditional leaders, religious leaders, community leaders play in resolving community level conflicts. And maybe before passing to Russia and China, I will pass to my colleague, and she may have some intervention as well.
Thanks. I would just briefly say on that topic that our efforts locally in the Sahel to build peace and to encourage that kind of dialogue are very important in building that link between the people and their government and addressing grievances. And I agree that religious communities, and in fact, any partners on the ground who can play an important role, we're looking to talk to them and involve them. And that does include religious communities.
One last thing I would say is, as part of those community conversations, not just broader civil society, but more specifically engaging with women and women's groups and ensuring that women are part of those dialogues and community interventions is absolutely crucial. What we do know is, of course, women and children bear really the burden of this kind of violence and of the displacement that occurs because of it. Just passing very quickly to Russia and China, absolutely Russia and China, particularly China, present throughout the region in an economic way, and increasingly, I think, with some with interest in security cooperation. With Russia, our sense generally is its presence has been primarily with an interest to sell products. Our view is with China is that there's a certain caveat emptor that with each of these governments that they should examine any and all deals that are offered to them very carefully, and they should weigh, obviously, the long-term potential burdens of taking on these deals. We certainly do not walk in and just say, you know, everyone else good, China bad, because I think that they are there and they are competing to give resources. On the other hand, we view with I would say, consternation, deals that do tie up critical resources and strategic minerals and other things, and that we remain in dialogue with governments to try to make sure, at least that they feel that they are making informed decisions. If we do have, you know, we have details on presence, and we'd be happy to get back to you with details on what some of the what
If you could, for the record, it'd be very, very helpful.
Okay,
Because there's
thank
not we look at so many of the other countries that are being malaffected by Chinese influence and bad governance
Absolutely.
model. We don't have a whole lot on the Sahel, so that would be great.
Okay.
Madam Chair, thank you for that very generous extension of time. I do ask unanimous consent that remarks by Ranking Member of the full committee, Michael McCall, be entered into the record. Thank you.
One of the things that was noted over and over again when on our visit a month or so ago was that there have been very few visits by high-level U.S. diplomatic personnel to the Sahel in recent years, and unlike the EU, the U.S. doesn't maintain a high-level diplomatic envoy to the region. So I wanted to know what your thoughts were about any changes that should be made to U.S. diplomatic engagement in the Sahel. Both of you, if you could respond to that.
Thank you very much. Since I have been to all of the countries, I assume you are saying that my level is not quite high enough, but I do not disagree. I would say that Undersecretary of Political Affairs David Hale has taken a great deal of interest in the Sahel, and after his visit, which I accompanied him on to Niger last February, he actually arranged for us to brief the Secretary on what we saw as the problem set and what our engagement could look like, which we did. Coming out of that, the Undersecretary has also directed us to go back and re-look at our diplomatic engagement strategy for the Sahel and looking at ways that, A, he can play a larger role, and we, the United States, can play a larger role. And we have been working on that and reviewing that with the Undersecretary. As regards the potential for a special envoy on Sahel issues, I know that many of our European partners do have a special-hatted envoy. I think that our Assistant Secretary and talking to other officials have taken on that question, and when there is a decision, you know, I think that there would be an announcement one way or the other, but it certainly is under consideration. We're looking at whatever ways are possible to help influence the situation there in a positive way.
Do you think that would be helpful? Is that being pushed for in the?
I think it is a possibility, and I would then defer to my boss, the Assistant Secretary, for a decision.
I'm sorry. Say that last part again.
So I would say I would defer to my boss, the Assistant Secretary, for a decision on that. I think we have weighed in, and but I think I would leave that to him to decide, and if they made a decision to announce.
Ms. Anderson, thoughts?
I would just say, yes, that's an area where we could do better in terms of high-level visits to the region, and I would hope that,
And, you know, I mean, I mentioned that in terms of diplomatic, but it's also the same thing with congressional as well. And so one of the things that we're going to really try to work on is to get more congressional delegations to go as well.
and maybe there could be a joint visit.
Well, there you go. Nice idea. We'll propose that.
I would hope we could have some visits in the not-too-distant future. You are always welcome, and I think it's always a big boost, not only diplomatically in advancing our agenda, but also to our staff, who are working under, as you know, very difficult circumstances.
Well, I always try to, when I travel abroad, pay particular attention to that, because when I go to country team meetings, to me, it's quite visible. People are demoralized and need to know that we respect the work they do. We know the work that's going on, and I think it's very important to offer that type of solidarity.
Yeah. Thank you.
What has been the impact of worsening security conditions in Mali, Burkina Faso, and parts of Niger on the ability of U.S. civilian personnel and assistance implementers to administer and oversee diplomatic and foreign aid activities? And I had asked Ms. Bard about the staffing situation, and I don't know if that's one of the reasons why positions are unfilled, but I would like for you to respond to that too, Ms. Anderson.
We are actually increasing our efforts in Niger and Burkina Faso, and yet it's getting, in some places, increasingly difficult to get out to the field and do the kind of oversight that we need to do. We work where we can, and there are cases where diplomatic security keeps us closer to the capital, and we're not actually able to send our staff out into the field, so we look for any innovations that we can find. We do a fair amount of third-party monitoring of our activities, and we have our partners implementing activities. We never want to put anybody into direct danger, and we have very many courageous partners who are out there. So we do third-party monitoring with using getting information from people who are already in the local locations and can send us information. We use technology to do that monitoring. Our staff, turning to the question about unfilled positions and the challenges in staffing USAID in the Sahel, it's hard to staff those positions sometimes. We've worked on something we're calling a difficult to staff incentive differential, which we've piloted. It seems to be having
What is it?
an impact.
What is it?
It's additional differential payment for people who are willing to go to those posts so that we align better with the State Department's policies, actually.
Are there any other incentives that could be offered, such as more frequent return visits home, back to the States? I mean, is there a package of benefits that could be put together?
These are things that we have been thinking about because we offer that in some other places, and I think that has
Where's an
been
example of where
successful.
you offer that?
In, for example, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, South Sudan.
And so there's a
So-
difference, so what you offer
That-
for those countries, you don't offer for people that are at Burkina Faso?
Yes.
I
And then we have worked with, in our bidding system for foreign service officers, ways to require people to bid on the priority positions that we establish, and those often include the Sahel. So we're
Do you
looking
think
at
that makes a difference?
different
I mean, in Afghanistan, for example, do you have trouble getting people to go to Afghanistan?
we think the incentives are actually, the financial incentives are working quite well.
So that could be a big possibility then,
Yes.
correct? So what does it take to make that happen?
Yeah. That's something that's ongoing in our review of the incentive that we've already provided. And then as we go through the next round of assignments, we'll have a look and see how it's working. If we can get the right people into the right places, great. If not, we'll have to turn to the next step.
So I'm not sure if that sounds very promising. I mean, that doesn't sound like anything that's getting ready to happen anytime soon.
Those considerations are also sort of a constant conversation that we have. One of the things I would say is if you make the sorts of changes that provide the incentives that are present in a place like Afghanistan, Somalia, some others, then you're taking on a one-year post and you're making a change in whether dependents can also travel to post. So it changes the tenor of the post. So I think that's an ongoing conversation and a balance with post leadership and the Undersecretary for Management and the department and our other agencies that you review, because there are trade-offs on any of these decisions when you're making that kind of calculation.
I understand that. I guess, being in a place that had a 7,000% increase in attacks in 6 months, and what you just described, I just don't know what that means in terms of an ongoing conversation and this and that. It just sounds like nothing's getting ready to happen soon.
We have a constant conversation with our post, in the case of Burkina Faso, with Ambassador Young and the Deputy Chief of Mission, with their management staff. They review, they hold emergency action committee meetings regularly, town hall meetings to ensure that they are keeping in touch with the dependent community and, in fact, the unofficial American community that is present there to ensure that they feel comfortable with the security situation. In fact, in Burkina, they held emergency action committee meetings this week and a town hall this week, and we continue a robust conversation. Absolutely, the safety and security of the American staff and family members is really our top priority. Beyond anything else, that's our first responsibility overseas.
So let me just state for the record that when I was in Burkina Faso, the staff made absolutely no complaints, didn't say they were looking for more staff. That was my opinion, especially when I see all of the violence that's increased, and it must be very frightening to work there. So that they were not pushing for that, but empty chairs are empty chairs. They do kind of speak for themselves. So I guess I'm still not quite clear what moves the dial so that a decision is made.
I could also add that we have the option when we have vacancies, whether it's caused by somebody departing unexpectedly or inability to fill a position, we can also turn to hiring people as personal services contractors, and we have done that pretty frequently. For example, in Niger, at the moment we have someone who's serving as a personal services contractor as the acting head of the operating unit there until we're able to fill the position. And that's sometimes more flexible for us, often more flexible.
Yes, sure, I understand that. So one last question before I move to Representative Houlihan. So do you think that the violence in Burkina Faso, I know some of it is ideological, but overall, do you think it's ideological or is it economic based?
I would say that it's a combination. I think that there are certainly
50-50?
I don't know. I think that there are elements of probably, again, frustration with the lack of state presence and service provision. I think that there are economic difficulties, poverty, competition for resources, and in fact there are, I think there's probably some fluidity, but I think there absolutely are committed jihadists in the region and people who were very vulnerable to recruitment.
Identified with one of the larger groups like a QIM or Boko Haram?
Or indeed, or Ansar al-Islam, which appears to be more of a homegrown Burkinabe group. And so I think it's a mix, and I think it's...
And again, I was just talking about Burkina Faso initially.
Right. It's an unholy mix, and that what is probably is what made it so difficult to get, to get your arms around, and for the Burkinabe government and security forces to take it on in any kind of effective way.
Representative Houlihan?
Thank you, and thank you, ladies, for coming today. I understand earlier, Ms. Bard, that you were talking a little bit about the importance of engaging women, particularly in extremism and violence situation in terms of security. Can you give us some detail about that, possibly? What does engagement look like, and how are you encouraging it in terms of peace and security?
I think I'll answer briefly and then pass to my colleague.
Thank you.
Because USAID also, I think, is heavily engaged. From the point of view of the embassy or the Department of State, we do outreach on many levels to reach women's groups to ensure that our public outreach and our community building activities include civil society, but particularly women's groups. I think, just as a policy matter, it is really important in these very economically challenged regions where there is large demographic pressure that every member of society feels that they have a legitimate voice. Our public diplomacy efforts and efforts in outreach try to reach at sort of a micro level, these small groups, but also at a macro level in our discussions with the host governments to ensure that their policies are inclusive. It's just a basic part of our DNA and the way that we work. Additionally, I think one of the best programs we have in Africa is the Young Africa Leaders Initiative, the YALI program, which it seeks to, these young people nominate themselves for and helps them come to the United States or go for regional training in Dakar and begin to build networks. So it's not exclusively women, but I think we work very hard to ensure that there is good representation of young women so that they get the exposure and the network opportunities to take back, whether they're in entrepreneurship or whether they themselves are moving into civil society or government positions, that they have that feeling of power so that they can contribute moving forward. We think that's very important to success of any of our policies there.
And in your particular function, and then I'd love to hear from you, Ms. Anderson, too, it also is important that people see what they hope to be, in a sense. When you're looking at your own staff in the region, is there a good diversity represented in terms of gender as well as other diversification?
Absolutely. In all of our embassies in the region, I think we look to recruit, and you're talking particularly about professional, locally engaged staff. Where possible, you want to have inclusion, not just gender inclusion, but also ethnic inclusion. Sure. In countries where often there's a great deal of scratchy relationships perhaps between ethnic groups, or there may be competition for power, it's very important that the embassies model to the best of their ability the inclusive nature that should exist in each of the countries.
Yeah, and the only reason I ask is in my very limited time here in Congress, I did have the opportunity to go to the Middle East and sat with the State Department there and was really pretty displeased with the ratio of men and women there in our own, Corps. And thank you, Ms. Anderson. If you have anything to add to that, I would love to hear too.
Thank you. Women and youth are central to all of our planning and our programming in USAID. They have to be, especially in the Sahel, for us to be successful. So when you think about, for instance, countering violent extremism, women can play a very positive role in peace and security, and they can also be co-opted to play terrible roles. So this has to be a part of our planning, and it's part of our policy in terms of how we plan our programs and engaging women and youth. When you think about the opportunities that we can present for women to create peace in their communities, one thing we're doing with our program that we call Voices for Peace, I think it's women in tech, a special effort to incorporate technology so that women can have their own radio programming and speak to larger numbers of people. in education, for example. In Niger, there's an 18% gap in enrollment between girls and boys. So we're always focusing on how can we ensure the equality and equities in our programs. Food security, we have to make sure that women are engaged and that women can have access to the kinds of, to land tenure, documentation of the land, to the inputs they need, the financing, and also have control over those resources, because they play a really important role in food security in the Sahel, as well as in their household food security and resilience.
And I know that I've run out of time, so I would love it if I could have another opportunity when we finish with everybody. That would be great. I apologize. Thank you.
I also think that in terms of our diversity in staff, I think we're doing pretty well. It's important also to think about, we also look at our own, our local staff, our Foreign Service national staff, and that's also important to us.
But on that note, though, I would say there is definitely more that needs to be done on the racial diversity on the U.S. staff. I understand the local staff, but the U.S. staff, there is a pretty sharp lack of diversity. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the courtesy of being part of this program, this hearing. And I am appreciative of the service of both of you. If I could just ask, is there an Assistant Secretary for West Africa and Security Affairs in place?
We have our Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Tibor Naj, is in place, yes.
And is that a permanent appointment?
It is a permanent appointment.
Had been confirmed?
He was a career Foreign Service officer and had retired and was appointed by the administration and has been in place since, I believe it is July of 2018.
And is there an assistant administrator for the Bureau for Africa? I think that's your deputy assistant, Ms. Anderson. Is there an administrator in place?
For Africa, the head of our Africa Bureau is EventID, and his title now is Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator as the head of the Bureau.
And he's in place?
Yes.
What's the person's name?
EventID.
Okay, and that's been in place since how long?
I think he's been in place since September of 2018.
Okay, so at least a year they've been in place. I think that's important because I was able to join the CODEL that Congresswoman Bass led to Djibouti, Burkina Faso, Niger, and certainly to Germany. One of the strongest proponents of friendship that I think we have in the competition to snatch Africa into one corner or the other, rather than treating the continent as a respected future leaders of the world, frankly, and an economy that's going to surpass many economies, is a question of security. The level of conflict is going to continuously undermine, I think, the potential for growth. So my question is, in your work, are you aware of the Africa Command and its work, and are there briefings that you all engage in to discern what the security level of the countries, some of the countries that I've mentioned? Every one of these countries, except Djibouti, of course, was concerned about security, and it was a detriment to any economic growth that they could have. So what is the relationship between, in particular, the Africa Bureau, the Assistant Secretary, and Africa Command?
Thank you very much for that. In fact, part of my responsibility, it's not just West Africa, but my other responsibility is regional peace and security issues for the continent, for the Africa Bureau. We have a very close relationship with AFRICOM, with the Africa Command, I was there in October, meeting with the officials there, as well as with ambassadors from 4 of the 5 G5 Sahel countries. Our ambassadors from Mauritania, from Niger, from Mali, and Burkina Faso all came, and we came together to discuss our joint security concerns and the ways that we could respond to that. And in fact, I will be going out in just a few weeks to, again, to AFRICOM to meet with our ambassadors from Ghana, Togo, and Benin to talk about some of the issues associated with security in those coastal countries. I absolutely agree with you that the security concerns are thwarting countries' economic ambitions. I think for our Assistant Secretary, the growth, the potential growth in markets and the youth bulge in these countries is one of the most important aspects that should inform our relationship with countries. The reality in the Sahel is, in many cases, humanitarian development concerns and the security concerns overweigh the potential economic development. I think we have a more encouraging story to tell in the short term and with countries like Ghana, with Cote d'Ivoire, with Senegal, and others. But we stay engaged with all of them. And so we very much appreciate your interest and your visits there. And we continue to coordinate. It is absolutely a 3D approach: development, defense, and diplomacy. It's absolutely crucial.
Well, and I appreciate that. I think it's important. I am not suggesting boots on the ground. I'm not suggesting engaging in war, but I do think it's important for, at the highest level of the State Department, the Secretary of State, to realize the detraction is too light a word that occurs for the success of Burkina Faso if the head of state is spending a great amount of time, and it looks as if that should be a pronounced policy of the State Department to work with the continent and countries on dealing with, either African Union or others are dealing with this mounting violence that occurs, decapitation, the taking of young girls. Just recently, it is certainly rampant in Nigeria, where, in particular, I just met the mother of Rebecca Sharabu, a Christian girl, that I would request what we're doing to help secure her freedom. But the point is, the violence is extensive. You sit in these countries and meet with their presidents, and they're consumed with it. And I just think it needs to be a high-profile issue at the State Department level to be able to engage with either other African countries that can be of help, to let it is a humanitarian crisis, but to let Africa know that we stand with them against this violence, and we want to assist them in those countries taking charge of this violence, because it is destabilizing, but it is also interfering with all the young leaders that are really trying to, and I say leaders, I'm talking about young people who are trying to create a new Africa. So.
Thank you very much. For us, our engagement, we absolutely agree that it is important for us to remain engaged with the countries that are facing violence, but also, frankly, with their regional partners to look at ways to help them push back on that. Additionally, a great deal of our assistance is in trying to help these countries build secure and accountable security services that are viewed by their populations as part of the solution and not part of the problem, to work with them so that they are able to meet the security challenges and the violence without, in fact, inflicting violence, further violence on innocent members of their own population. And so that I appreciate your interest and your continued interest. It absolutely is a priority for us.
I thank the chair, and I'd appreciate it if I could get some report back on Rebecca's standing. You were shaking your head as you know the story out of, and there's several of us engaged. It seems like she's being particularly brutalized, and we hope she's alive and wish that she's alive, and praying for her, but we need to know if anything that we're able to do.
Thank you very much. We will be happy to get back to you with the details. I don't have them with me right now. Yes, Nigeria is within my area of responsibility, and absolutely our embassy is consistently engaged with the Nigerian government and with other partners to see what we can do to encourage her release and to ensure her well-being. I appreciate your interest.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Representative Hulen, you're welcome.
Thank you. I wanted to just follow up on some of those questions, and I believe, Ms. Anderson, you would be probably most appropriate to answer this question. We talked a little bit about women and their engagement helpfully and in a harmful way in terms of peace and security, but no woman could be or girl can be helpful or harmful if they're not alive, if they're not healthy. And one of the things that I've been struck by is the defunding on the United States side of the UNFPA. And I wanted to understand from you, Ms. Anderson, what is USAID doing to help make sure that maternal mortality continues to be addressed, to make sure that women and girls are healthy in the absence of UNFPA support in that area?
Thank you. Maternal and child health is of critical importance to us in the Sahel, and we also recognize that almost 65% of the population is under 25, and we recognize the challenges posed to maternal and child health by unhealthy child spacing. So we are investing in the latest fiscal year approximately $29 million across the Sahel in maternal and child health, and about $24 million in family planning, voluntary family planning.
And I helped lead a letter that basically implored this administration to continue or recontinue the funding for UNFPA. Is there anything else that a member of Congress that we here in this body can do to be helpful, to continue to advocate for that? Is there anything else that we can be doing to be more helpful on this issue that is clearly very worrisome for many of us?
I think I would say that was a policy decision.
Ms. Bard, do you have anything to add? My last question for you all has to do with the schools that I understand have been being closed. 9,000 schools have been closed across the Sahel and Central Africa, and people are in tenuous situations in terms of their ability to access education. What are the alternative efforts that are ongoing? Where are these kids and young people able to seek education, if anywhere?
So I think first I'll take that on as really a larger policy issue. I know that when I was in Burkina Faso, President Kabore made an absolute point. That's one of the most worrisome aspects for him, was at that point there were well over 1,000 schools that had been forced to be closed because of violence, which created situations where the teachers, in most cases, had to flee. It's an aspect of the lack of state presence, which again reduces state legitimacy and the sense of the government delivering services to the population. And indeed, it makes young people ever more vulnerable. I think, in the first instance, I think in all of these countries, there is intent and desire for the security services to retake and then try to hold some of these areas in order to, bit by bit, in an incremental way, get schools back open, begin to get community and local and regional governmental operations going again. But I think, I would be lying if I said this would be anything but an incremental effort that will take a good bit of time, because security services can go in and take a village, clear it out, but what is required to actually hold it in the sense of rebuilding the community is that state presence, the police, the gendarmes, the judges, just all the elements of a community that operates, including teachers and the families and the kids. So one of the aspects of this that I think is most destructive is the closure of schools and what we would call année blanche, the situation where children are missing years of their education because it's very difficult to make that back. It's part of our effort and intervention, and I know USAID is engaged as well.
The USAID, what kind of efforts are you using, maybe with UNICEF, to create alternative learning? You guys mentioned something about radio programming, faith-based learning. Is there any other alternative opportunities for people to seek education?
It's incredible to see how much communities and families value education, and even when the children are in danger by being in school because the school is associated with the government and it's a target of attack, the value of that education is so important. And one of the things that we are doing is as part of our resilience efforts, is to help schools be prepared. So if there's an attack, how do you quickly build back? How do you quickly get back into action with your school? We're targeting out-of-school youth as well, so that we can find ways that they can have alternatives to actual formal school learning. And we're part of a network of other development partners that's called Education in Emergencies. So we're learning from each other, and we're using any kind of technology that's available to be able to provide education to the kids who are affected by violence and they've been, for whatever reason, not able to go to their actual schools.
Thank you. And I am out of time, sadly, but I would like to emphasize that although I do understand that UNFPA lack of funding is a policy decision, it is present in all of the Sahel region. And as a result, the fact that we're not actively engaged in funding the issues that you're talking about with women's reproductive health and health in general means that people are dying as a consequence, particularly women. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
I just have a couple more questions. We'll be finished. I wanted to ask you, to what extent is a lack of transparency surrounding natural resource extraction in Burkina Faso driven political grievances in the country? And what do you know in general about the natural resources and the contracts?
I think I will have to get back to you with details on that. I think in a general sense, obviously, lack of transparency in disposition of critical resources in resource-challenged countries is always an area of potential grievance. I know that Burkina Faso is blessed with critical minerals. But the specifics beyond the companies that I know are operating in the region and how those
Do you know if there are any American companies?
Sorry?
Do you know if there are any American companies?
Not major mining companies. The Canadians are very present, however.
How about the French?
In mining, I don't have that detail. The Canadians I know about because, of course, it was the Canadian mining company's convoy that was attacked late last week where 39, 40 people were killed. It was really an egregious attack, very worrisome.
So I had asked earlier, but I don't think you guys responded, about our relationship with the French, how we cooperate, especially on the security situation. And also, I mean, I asked about the natural resources because, obviously, to address the root causes in these countries, we have to look at their natural wealth. And while we address the surface issues, I just always wonder what we're doing around those issues as well. If they had control of their resources with better contracts or good contracts, maybe they would have more resources to do things like education, all the schools you talked about being closed, be able to actually respond to their own security situation.
No, I'd be happy to talk about our cooperation with the French, and then maybe I will pass it to Cheryl, who can talk a bit about our donor coordination with the French, which I think is also quite robust. Both in diplomacy and in security, we have a very close relationship with the French. Certainly in the Sahel through Operation Barkhane, the French counterterrorism efforts, we have supported that. We view their efforts in pushing back on JNIM and other jihadist actors is very much in our own interest in promoting stability in the region. We consult very closely with the French. We have a P3 process where we have regular conversations with our French and British partners. In fact, our Assistant Secretary does regular secure video teleconferences.
Do you think their financial investment is close to ours in terms of their embassy? Do they have difficulties staffing it like we do? Do they have their counterpart to USAID? Do they put in an equal amount, more, less?
I think the French are very present in each and every one of these countries, obviously, and most of them, the Francophone ones, they have these long-term post-colonial relationships, and they are
And that's
very
why I'm
present.
asking. I just want to know that
The
they,
question of how they staff and how
Doesn't mean they're
easily they can
positive.
staff, I don't have the detail. I don't have the detail on that. I do know, on an individual level in each of these countries, there's very close coordination between our chiefs of mission and our diplomatic and our security personnel. And certainly from Washington with Paris, we keep in very close touch.
thank you.
By some measures, in the Sahel, we're the largest donor, especially in humanitarian assistance. But across the Sahel, actually, altogether, we're the second largest bilateral donor, and we're number 2 to the French. So it's really important for us to be coordinating with the French on humanitarian as well as development and all our resilience work. We have structures set up in each country so that we've got coordination across the bilateral and multilateral donors, preferably with the government, with a partner government involved. And so there we're ensuring that we have the appropriate division of labor and that we're not working at cross purposes and not duplicating efforts. We also coordinate at the headquarters level. There's another structure that's been set up as well, and that is called the Sahel Alliance. So part of the G5 Sahel Alliance on Security and Development. We are an observer. Our status is observer in the Sahel Alliance, and there was a very large meeting of the alliance last December, including the partner countries represented. And I think there's been a lot of, at least a lot of pledging of support. I think what's important now is the real coordination and actually delivering what's been promised. And I have to say we're not a full member, partly because there was an expectation of being part of the mechanisms that were set up, and those can be sometimes cumbersome and slow and hard for us, given the requirements that we have for delivering development assistance. But anyway, it provides us a platform for coordination that I think is very important, and it also is a very important statement by the G5 Sahel members that, yes, security actions are important and our armed forces are important, but development and building resilience is also very important, and preventing violent extremism and preventing violence in the region is very important as well.
Well, I just want to thank both of you for your time today, and of course for your service, and anything that I can do, we can do here to be supportive of your efforts. Very much appreciate hearing your recommendations and advice. So with this, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.